I spend a lot of time thinking about the distant past, and while I like to imagine an ancient world that was peaceful, simple, and beautiful, I know that in reality, our ancestors were not only a lot more sophisticated technologically than we give them credit for, but they could also be very cruel in the use of their technology. Most people assume that the first machines were invented in the Middle Ages, but when one examines some of the archaeological artifacts of antiquity, it becomes clear that people from long ago were not all as primitive as we were led to believe. The Antikythera mechanism is a name given to an artifact described as the first analog computer, and while it's nothing like our modern computers, it was a hand-powered device used by the Greeks to predict astronomical positions and eclipses decades in advance. It could be used to track events, like periodic athletic games that took place every 4 years, similar to the Olympics, or for astrological purposes, such as keeping track of eclipses and other events related to the calendar. Dated to about 150 BC, it was found in the Mediterranean Sea and is composed of a complex clockwork mechanism made of at least 37 meshing bronze gears with teeth that enable it to follow the movements of the moon and sun through the zodiac and even model the irregular orbit of the moon, where the moon's velocity is higher in its perigee than in its apogee. The knowledge of this technology was lost at some point in antiquity, and similar technological works of this complexity didn't appear again until the development of mechanical astronomical clocks in Europe in the 14th century. Fragments of the Antikythera mechanism are kept in a museum in Athens, along with a number of artistic reconstructions and replicas to demonstrate how it may have looked and worked. As interesting and practical as that Greek artifact is, it still pales in comparison to some of the ancient myths and legends that the classical Greeks and other civilizations had regarding vivid descriptions of automatons, that is to say, self-moving robots, animated statues, or artificial life using biotechne, an ancient Greek term for life through craft, or what we now call biotechnology. While we don't have the physical, tangible artifacts to examine, like the Antikythera mechanism, we do have the ancient stories and recorded concepts regarding these animated manufactured beings that were made, not born. These were not just objects that were brought to life by a magical spell or command by a god, but synthetic beings that were products of technology that may have been said to be made by gods, but through the use of familiar tools and materials that were real and available in their time. One example is the story of Jason and the Argonauts, about an ancient Greek mythological hero and leader of the Argonauts, who were a band of heroes in the years before the Trojan War, who were also referred to as the Mynians, or Proto-Greeks, meaning they came before the classical Greeks. In this story, they battled synthetic bronze robots, and the most famous was called Talos, and he was a robotic giant that allegedly guarded the island of Crete. This myth is really ancient, and was first written down about 750 BC, but was told orally before that time, and Talos was described as a killer robot that defended King Minos' kingdom. This was the Minoan civilization, and he was self-moving, marching around the entire island 3 times a day, programmed to spot invaders, and then pick up and hurl boulders and giant stones at them to sink approaching ships. There are ancient coins from Crete showing Talos throwing rocks, and there was also a golden wonder dog Laelaps, that also guarded the island, an artificial hound that never lost its prey, also made by the gods. He could make his body red hot and roast any intruder pressed up against his chest. Now, in the case of Talos, instead of blood, he had a life fluid that ran through a tube from his head to his toe called ichor, which was the fluid of the gods. And Jason and the Argonauts encountered Talos on their quest for the Golden Fleece. They eventually defeated Talos by tricking him into removing a bolt on his ankle, which allowed this ichor fluid to drain out, which eventually destroyed him. In the myth, the ichor flowed out like molten lead, and he collapsed. And in the movies, Talos is depicted as looking like stone, but in the story, he's described as metallic with human-like features, sort of like a cyborg being, like a machine-human hybrid. While there's no evidence that a robot like Talos was real, I wouldn't discount the story as total myth either. It's possible that the story is an exaggeration of some sort of mechanical guardian which was erected to ward off invaders, or possibly used to terrify and torture them once captured. When one considers the way the golden hound would glow red, it reminds me of another metallic device resembling an animal from the myth also recreated in ancient times, a fire-breathing bronze bull. Legend has it that during the 6th century BC, a brass worker named Perillus of Athens designed what is arguably the most sadistic torture method to date, the brazen bull. In this device, the victim would be placed inside a hollowed brass bull with a fire lit underneath. A system of tubes inside the statue would then amplify the victim's screams to sound like it was a raging bull. The story goes that the tyrant ruler Phalaris was so appalled by this device that he tricked Perillus into entering the bull and burned him alive inside of it as its first victim. Of course, there were many others who were burned alive inside the bull, and many classical writers and historians have told the story, having actually seen the bull, so it really did exist. But it doesn't end there with the Athenian king. More than 300 years later, during the First Punic War, which was between Rome and Carthage, so that means the Roman Empire and the Phoenicians, Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, invaded Sicily. Hannibal and his father were both very famous Carthaginian generals, and I'll eventually do an entire video on just Hannibal, as the Punic Wars changed history. If Rome had lost, the world would be a very different place today under Phoenician rule. So when Sicily was invaded, its treasures were plundered, and one of the prized items that the Phoenicians found was the notorious bronze bull, which was shipped across the Mediterranean back to Carthage, which is in Tunisia, North Africa, and it remained in Carthage for another 100 years. The archaeological evidence is clear that there was child sacrifice during this time, and I don't want to just single out the Phoenicians, as sacrifice was universally practiced in the ancient world, even though some historians try to deny it, probably because of a political bias. But it seems very likely that the bull was also used by the Carthaginians, even though I can't prove it directly. So about a century later, the Roman army led by Scipio defeated the Carthaginian army led by Hannibal in the Second Punic War, and the Romans recovered the bronze bull and had it shipped back to Sicily. And they set up a monument against the cruelty and viciousness of tyrants like Phalaris as a sort of Roman propaganda. That is to say, trust the Romans and you won't have any more tyrannical rulers to worry about. Polaris and the bronze bull was not the only time a realistic statue was brought to life by the screams of burning people inside of it. Another Sicilian king burned his victims inside of a giant bronze statue of a man. And another Sicilian king used a bronze statue of a stallion that he used in the same way. And these kings would offer big rewards to inventors that came up with the most cruel and sadistic method of animating these statues through novel torture mechanisms. Another Sicilian king, Dionysius of Syracuse, held a contest offering rewards for whoever could build the most advanced weapons of war. He invited inventors to a competition, which resulted in the first mechanized catapults around 400 BC. Offering prizes to military engineers seemed to work well, as Alexander the Great's father, Philip II of Macedon, did the same thing, as did many others, which resulted in technological advances for war machines, such as a giant claw which could pick up invading ships. There are many other innovations that came about for war, but I'd rather focus on some of the more positive inventions. And the epicenter for this creativity at this time was Alexandria, Egypt, where many self-moving devices were created to be used in theater production, but also for parades as lifelike depictions of gods to impress the masses. Some of these automatons were miniature, some of them were colossal, but very few, if any, survived into modern times, and we only know about them from the few writings we have left, as the Library of Alexandria was also torched, and much was lost in the fires. One of the most fascinating areas of experimentation was the ancient use of magnetism, and King Ptolemy II of Alexandria would have amazing parades which featured self-moving mechanical devices that moved through the streets in 279 BC in a grand procession that lasted for days. There were also many monumental lifelike statues of gods and goddesses, each on carts pulled by 300 men. One example was of a 15-foot tall goddess sitting on a throne and dressed in silk clothes that would periodically stand up and pour a jug of milk into a large bowl and then sit back down. King Ptolemy II didn't use his animated statues to torture people that I know of, but rather seemed to use them to reinforce the perception that he was a god. He also married his sister, who died, and then he had a statue of her commissioned where she was made into a goddess, and allegedly it had iron rods inside of it and was made to suspend in the air through the use of magnetism. It obviously did not survive, and we don't know how it was done or how effective it was, but the idea was to impress and astonish people rather than to torture and execute them. Another interesting self-moving machine was introduced by the Macedonians after Alexander the Great defeated the democratic Athenians and installed a dictator, Demetrius, who destroyed the democracy and had a giant animatronic snail to lead the most sacred procession in Athens. And this was likely done to mock democracy. As the giant snail inched along in the parade, it even oozed a trail of slime along the street. And right behind the snail was a troop of donkeys or asses to drive home the insult and humiliate the defeated democratic Greeks, who were once celebrated for their quick action and intelligence. And this was probably done to symbolize the degeneracy that they felt came about with democracy, which failed after a few short decades and became ineffective and seen as mob rule. At least this is what was thought to have been meant by the slow snail. Meanwhile, in Sparta, in 207 BC, Nabis became king, and he and his wife Apega were notorious for their torture and executions. And it is said that Apega was much more cruel than her husband when it came to murder, so she was really feared, which is probably why King Nabis had a lifelike mechanical robot replica constructed of her that wore Apega's fine clothes and had a realistic wax or plaster face painted to look very realistic, and Abis would then summon a citizen of Sparta to get them drunk and demand their money and property, and if they refused, he would say, perhaps my queen, Apega, will be more persuasive, and the man would then be taken to meet the fake Apega, and when he would reach out to take her hand, the robot would stand up, triggering springs to raise her arms and suddenly grab the victim, and under her clothing, the body was studded with iron spikes. She would then tighten her embrace, drawing the victim closer and driving the spikes deeper. And according to historians, Abis destroyed many men in Sparta in this way. I know I said I wanted to avoid the more grotesque mechanisms used for harm, but I just couldn't resist with this one. It's possible that the story of the spiked queen Apega might have inspired the medieval torture device known as the Iron Maiden, which consisted of a casket with spikes on the inside which could be closed slowly, impaling the living person inside. Of course, the medieval era was the golden age of torture, and there's even a medieval torture museum in Florida where the Iron Maiden and other torture devices, some even worse if you can believe it, are on display.
Punishment for slander, gossip, and making jokes about government officials. So like half of the United States would have their tongue spiked at this point.
Yes. Probably more than half.
Nailed it.
Nailed it.
This is quite disturbing.
It is disturbing.
I was not prepared for the chastity belt portion of the tour.
Well, I find it fascinating because we only hear about chastity belts for women.
Yeah.
But there were some for men.
Yeah.
I think that should be shared more.
When a lot of it is not just to prevent sexual activity, some of it's for like destroying parts of anatomy. I'll just leave it at that.
I mean, why don't we talk about this?
Because it's very disturbing.
I'm enjoying this education.
Oh, I think I'm getting a little woozy. I'm a medic. It's talking about ripping out things that don't need ripping out. Whew.
I'm intrigued.
I bet you are. I don't know how much of this we're going to show, because this is pretty graphic stuff.
It's cool. I don't know why you did anything bad.
I would never do anything bad.
Like
to be deserving of any of this torture, because, oh my gosh. I can't even imagine, when you go through here, you imagine yourself being put in whatever
those vices.
device,
Ugh.
and you just can't imagine.
No.
It's so crazy.
Yeah.
This is so disturbing. They get so creative in how they hurt and kill people. It's crazy. This dude is tied down. His arms and legs are bound, and then they put a basket up here with a rat inside of it, and on his abdominal area, and eventually that rat's gonna get hungry, and it's just gonna eat him alive through his stomach, and eventually it will kill him, but it'll be a very slow, very painful death. How do people think this stuff up, man?
Hesiod's theogony contains other examples of ancient technology that were used to create artificial beings. Hesiod was an ancient Greek poet who lived around 700 BC, about the same time as Homer, and along with Homer is credited with establishing Greek religious customs. In Greek, his name literally means he who emits the voice, and his epic poem Theogony translates to the genealogy or birth of the gods. In it, after Prometheus steals fire and gives it to mankind, Zeus orders the creation of the first woman, Pandora, as a new punishment for mankind. While I won't get too deep into the occult or esoteric significance of the Pandora myth in this presentation, I will now briefly touch on it. According to the myth, Pandora opened a jar, commonly referred to as Pandora's box, releasing all the evils of humanity. Although much later versions of the story portray Pandora as an innocent woman who unknowingly opened this box of evil, Hesiod's original described Pandora as a creation built by the gods and sent to Earth on the orders of Zeus to punish humans for discovering fire. Fire represents an inner esoteric wisdom, a divine knowledge, which does not come from reading books, but from a heightened intuition, which some have called gnosis. This ties it to the ancient saying, "Know thyself," and the biblical story of the tree of knowledge regarding the divinity that can be attained by, according to esoteric interpretations of the Zohar, touching the forbidden fruit but not eating of it. So, from Zeus's perspective, the angry god that wanted to keep the attainment of divine knowledge and wisdom away from men, Pandora's mission on Earth, as the evil woman, was to infiltrate the human world and release her jar of miseries. Understanding that the forbidden fruit is the orgasm, and that in an esoteric context is both the key to enlightenment and, if misused, also the road to spiritual death. One can decode the myth to understand how a woman can be seen as potentially evil and as a punishment, especially if she's very beautiful, enchanting, and gifted. The word Pandora means all gifts, and she was the ancient Greek version of Eve, the first mortal woman, a creation of the gods, and an instrument of the wrath of Zeus, sent to torture mankind with a type of misery that, in a spiritual context, was worse than the medieval torture devices, as she had the ability to drain a man's life essence, his prana, chi, life force, or vril. My name is Robert Sepehr. I'm an anthropologist. My published work is available on Amazon, as well as through various other major book outlets. They make a great gift. If you'd like to support my work, you could do that through patreon.com. There should be a link in the description section for those that are interested. I appreciate it. Thank you. Please hit the like button and subscribe for future updates. As always, I look forward to reading your comments, so please leave me your thoughts below. Please have a wonderful weekend, and I hope to see you again soon.